All right, lecture time. Let's learn ourselves a little bit more about psychology. So, in the last lecture, we covered the modular architecture of the mind, by which I mean we should expect the mind, like the rest of our body or other man made tools, to come in a variety of functionally specific pieces. So we have lots of different types of knives for cutting due to the different demands of cutting in different contexts that just require different designs. The same knife that's used to cut butter is not as efficient as the knife that's used to cut bread, which is not as efficient as the knife you use to cut steak at the table versus steak in the kitchen, or debone a fish. We have a lot of different knives for a lot of different tools. And similarly, in our body, we have a different variety of organs and cells and tissues and biological systems for solving different adaptive problems. Livers, lungs, hearts, immune systems, eyes, things like that. And the same is going to be true of our mental organs as well, our psychology. We have these psychological organs like eyes and ears that take in specific kinds of information, and they do so in very distinct ways from one another because the demands of those tasks are radically different. Taking visual light from the world is a far different task than taking in auditory signals from the world, and translating those into usable outputs requires much different cognitive mechanisms. And as a quick aside here, the presence of these physical differences in our information collection devices, like our eyes, like our ears, tongues, noses, things like that. These different physical differences in information collecting devices also imply the presence of differences in information processing devices. So you can't use the same device to take in light and transform that into useful behavioral outputs the same way you do with sound, because the inputs come in very different forms. They can carry different types of information about the world, and we need different mental mechanisms for translating these inputs, like light, scent, sound waves, for taking them in and then translating those into different outputs like perceptions of color, translating those into smells, depth, emotions, even actions. And this is a point that I also want to return to for future lectures, but feel free to bear this in mind for now. This idea that these physical differences in the information collection devices imply the presence of psychological ones applies to other parts of our body as well. And this is going to come up in the future, specifically with respect to sex differences, what we would call sexual dimorphism, where males and females tend to have different physical traits. In humans, as well as in many other species, males and females look different in terms of their size, in terms of their ornamentation. Males often tend to be larger. They may sometimes have horns or bright feathers that females of the species don't develop. And these physical differences could not have been selected for or persisted in the population if they didn't come with corresponding behavioral differences, and thus psychological ones. So to spoil the explanation here for what we're seeing a bit, the reproductive interests and challenges that males and females face sometimes diverge. That is, in many respects of life, males and females are similar. We require food. We take in light and process it using similar mechanisms. We all have to walk around the world. We have to grasp things. We have to talk. A lot of the problems we face are similar. But sometimes you end up with different problems that males and females face, often in regard to sexual mating, reproductive best interests. And these differences in reproductive best interests create physical differences and psychological differences that follow. Because you can't have a physical difference if you don't have behavioral differences. Otherwise, the physical difference would make no impact and it wouldn't be selected for. So when you see Shaq and his girlfriend here, and Shaq is massive and his girlfriend, I think, is, I want to say maybe 5 foot. I don't know how tall he is. He's very tall. It's a very stark contrast. Most sexual dimorphisms are not this big, but sometimes in other species, this is more of the norm than the exception. And we'll talk about why that's the case later. In any case, returning to our last lecture, we saw split brain patients, talked about those a bunch, and we saw how they showed that they have mental adaptations that can work entirely independent of one another. And our mental organs here, they don't necessarily need to share information or even know that they exist. So the example we looked at here, this was square A and B. These are actually the same color. And you can verify this yourself, but you have one part of your brain, the visual system, that makes certain assumptions about the world, and these assumptions say that these two are different colors. And then you have another part of your brain that can hold this mental representation of these as the same color. And these two parts don't need to disagree. The important demonstration here is that these two parts are separate. They hold different bits of information, they do different things, and they don't need to share information or come to a single conclusion. And we can also see these types of modular interactions occur like when people are on a diet. You feel a mental conflict. Do I want to eat this food because it's attractive, tasty food, or do I want to avoid it so I can lose weight in the future? You have different parts of the brain with different goals and different outputs and different information processing mechanisms. So because of all of this talk of modularity, we came to appreciate that there really isn't a single you in your brain. Just like there's no real body in your chest. It's not like your heart is really your body and the rest of it isn't. Everything is just a different piece of the same thing. And while it can be a useful linguistic or mental shorthand for us to talk about how there's a single person or a single body, because all these systems need to work together to coordinate their behavior and do things, pick singular courses of action and execute them, it's really not an accurate way to describe the mind. So if I was to say something to you like, deep down, I'm really a good guy, a better way to understand what I'm saying is not by thinking that there's a true me somewhere in my brain or in my body, but rather that I'm going to favor certain behavioral courses of action in the future as my body coordinates to pick one of them. If I say deep down I'm really a good guy, the way you think about that is not there's a single person in there, but the parts of the brain that are involved with altruism and cooperation are perhaps more likely to direct action relative to ones that are focused on more selfish things. At least that's what you're trying to communicate to others. And the reason that you have to coordinate this, because it's not like your hands can stay in one. I can't sit with my hands and type on my computer while my legs take off and walk down the street. Our entire body does have to operate as a coordinated system, and that's where this idea of a single person or a single body comes in mind. And somehow the conflicts between all these different outputs of the systems have to be managed in some capacity. So we do use terms like you, he, I. They're just not the best way to understand our psychology. And so today, in general, I wanted to pull our attention deeper into this idea of modularity and expand upon it a little bit. One part of that discussion is going to involve highlighting the distinction between the evolutionary function of parts of our brain, what we're going to call their ultimate function, and then how those same parts operate in the immediate world they encounter on more of a moment-to-moment basis. And we're going to call this the proximate function. So we're going to discuss the difference between ultimate function, the evolutionary, the adaptive function, and the proximate, more immediate functioning. We're also going to go on to examine the modular nature of our learning adaptations in this lecture and the next. And we're going to see how the ability to learn itself isn't just one general capacity, but rather represents a series of unique psychological adaptations that govern learning in terms of what we can learn, how well we can learn it, how quickly can we learn it, and so on. Because learning, it's not this one general thing that just naturally happens. You need the capacity to learn built into you. And the more we come to understand how learning is going to operate in all of these different domains of life to deal with different adaptive problems and how they require different assumptions about the world, we're also going to come to appreciate that learning is a thing to be explained itself, not exactly an explanation for a behavior. A lot of you probably heard something like this before, where if you're asking, how did someone come to learn, or how did someone come to speak the language they do? Oh, well, they learned it from their culture. But that's not really an explanation, because then you have to explain how this learning occurred, why this learning occurred. We need to dig far deeper and actually explain what learning is and why it's happening and when it does and doesn't work out well. So to begin with here, I wanted to briefly return to the previous lecture just so we can expand more on this idea of modularity. And I can give you a couple more examples about how the part of the brain that's talking isn't always the part of the brain that's making the decisions. So here, just to recap, we had our split brain patients where you sever corpus callosum in the middle of the brain, lets the right and left hemispheres communicate. And then you give them tasks to do that each of the brain halves can now respond to independently. And both halves are capable of vision, as we saw, and they're also capable of responding to questions and performing actions using the motor system. But only one side is particularly good at speaking. So when you show the split brain patient a different picture on each of their visual fields, in this case a snowy scene and the foot of a chicken, and you ask them to use their hands to select what they see, something that corresponds to it, they pick a snow shovel for the snowy scene, and they pick a chicken coop for the chicken foot. And then you remove this visual divider from them, and you ask them, why did you pick what you picked? Ask them to explain their choices now that both halves of the brain can see what both hands have selected. The part of the brain that's talking, which is only on the left side and controls speech, says something like, I picked the shovel for cleaning up after the chickens. And we know this can't be true because they don't have the access to that information. We know why they picked what they did, because of the visual stimulation we showed them. But the part of the brain that's talking is just spinning this plausible story to explain the actions of its hands. And as I argued before, and I'll continue to argue today, we're not actually any different from the split brain patients. And there are many examples of this. Part of the brain that's talking doesn't necessarily know what it's talking about phenomenon, which arise in normal people, at least as far as they don't have brain damage that we know of. And I want to talk about some examples. In this case, they come from a paper by Nisbet and Wilson called Telling More Than We Can Know, Verbal Reports on Mental Processes, published back in 1977. Great paper. And in that paper, the authors propose that regular people, like you or I, or at least the part of our brain that's talking, might not actually have true introspective awareness to how the decisions it made were arrived at. That is, the part of the brain that's talking isn't actually aware of the reasons for our behavior or the processes that led to it. So I could ask you a simple example here, which is, what is your name? And most people are going to be able to reach a correct answer to this pretty quickly. You know what your name is. I know what my name is. So now keep that answer in mind, and I'm going to ask you a second question, which is, how did you come up with that answer? And if you ask most people this question, what's your name? My name is this. How did you come up with that answer? You're probably not going to get much more of a compelling answer than, I just know my answer. It just came to mind. I just thought about it. But that's not really very informative for understanding the processes that our brain is going through, how our mind is structured, what steps it took to arrive at this information, how is it stored in memory, how is it retrieved, what cues can retrieve it, what else is it hooked up to. We don't really know how this process worked. We just became aware of the output, of the solution to the problem. And then we can ask people other similar questions and maybe wonder if they're not so different. So that is, I might ask you a question, why do you prefer one piece of clothing over another? In this case, we might also expect the part of the brain that's talking to not fully understand the reasons either. And indeed, that's exactly what one of the experiments the researchers in this paper report on. In this case, what they did is they showed up to a shopping mall, basically, and they set up a display of 4 pairs of stockings. Stockings are what you're looking at here. And they brought 52 people over to look at these stockings, not at the same time, but they brought 52 people over. There are 4 pairs of stockings, and they say, which of these 4 pairs do you like the best? And then they asked them, why do you like it? And of course, because this is a psychology experiment, all 4 pairs of stockings were identical. So you have 4 identical pairs of stockings on a display, and you're asking people to pick a favorite and explain why they like what they do. For whatever reason, it's kind of a fun fact, but people overwhelmingly selected the rightmost pair of stockings on the display. That is, about 4 times as many people picked the one that was on the right than the one on the far left. And I don't know why they did that exactly. The authors don't really know why they did that either. But when you asked people to explain their choices, no participant spontaneously mentioned the position of the stockings. And in fact, when the researchers asked these people explicitly, why did you pick the ones you did it have anything to do with their location on the display? The participants would usually explicitly deny it. No, the position had no impact on my decision. Or sometimes they would just look at the researcher weird, as if they didn't understand the question. Because it's a very peculiar question. Why would I pick stockings that were on the right instead of the left? That's not a good reason to pick stockings. That question doesn't make much sense. Did I hear you right? But none of them mentioned that they liked the stockings on the right side because they were on the right side, and many would explicitly deny this was part of their decision-making, even though it clearly mattered. Most of them would like to reference, I imagine, some other feature. Oh, I like the stitching better. This pair feels softer. I like the color. Again, even though they're identical, the part of the brain that's talking is making justifications that might not have anything to do with the actual reason the decision was made. And this isn't an isolated case. Another study they report on found that people could actually change their opinions that they held, or at least reported on, as early as 1 or 2 weeks prior without even being aware their opinions had changed. So in this experiment, again, this paper's from 1977. It was conducted a long time ago. So the subject matter here might sound a little bit strange to some people, but they were asking high school students about their opinions on busing school children to achieve racial integration. So, are you in favor of busing certain students to certain schools to achieve racial integration, or are you opposed to this? And so from these students, they asked them about their opinions. They wrote down their answers on a survey. They made 2 groups of students. And there were 3 students per group. And either all 3 of these were pro-busing, or all 3 of these were anti-busing. So all 3 of the members in each of these groups agreed on the issue, and they gathered them together under the pretenses of, we're going to talk about this. Then a confederate is someone who is working for the experimenter secretly. So the participants don't know this person's working for the experiment. A confederate is put in these groups, and they are assigned the task of arguing the opposite point to try and persuade them. So you have 3 students who are anti-busing. The confederate is supposed to argue a pro-busing stance. And if you have 3 students who are pro-busing, the confederate is supposed to argue an anti-busing stance. And it worked. The Confederates were very effective because they used a slightly different scale to measure these students' attitudes. And most of the pro-busing students ended up being far more on the anti-busing side after the experiment, and many of the anti-busing students ended up on the pro-busing side. The Confederate was very, very effective at persuading people to change their minds. The attitudes had changed. But interestingly, when you asked these students about what their opinion on the matter had been a mere week or 2 ago when they were asked about it, reminding the students, you have filled out this scale before, we're going to go back and check the accuracy of your answers, The participants in these experimental groups here recalled their opinion as 2 weeks ago, 1 or 2 weeks ago, as being far different than what their past opinion actually was. So that as the anti-busing students, they had their mind changed to be pro-busing. They reported being a lot more pro-busing a week or two ago. And the pro-busing students who were persuaded to be anti-busing, they also reported being a lot more anti-busing 2 weeks ago. And in fact, this difference was so extreme that the students that were originally, say, in favor of busing for racial integration, by the time the Confederate was done with them, they were actually expressing attitudes that were more anti-busing than the original people that were brought together in the anti-busing group. By contrast, control students that didn't receive any Confederate argumentation here, they were able to accurately report on what their opinions were a week or two prior. So in other words, in this case, there's the conscious part of the brain that's talking, and it doesn't seem to be aware that its opinion has changed. Or at the very least, it wasn't willing to tell other people that its opinion had changed. And there are many other such examples like this discussed in the paper. Now, this is not to say that we're always going to be wrong in reporting what or why we do what we do, or like what we like. But it's merely to note that the part of the brain that's talking here doesn't always have access to accurate introspective information about what's going on in the rest of the brain. To the extent the part that's talking ends up being right at times, that accuracy might actually be due to factors unrelated to any genuine introspective knowledge. It might actually just be right more by luck, by chance, by plausibility, than actual knowledge. And so the part of the brain here that's talking doesn't always seem to have genuine access to information about the decisions it's trying to explain. And it seems, perhaps, it doesn't need access to information to perform some or all of its tasks. And to give you a sense as to why, start thinking about the function of communication itself, the adaptive function of communication itself. Why do we have a part of the brain that's talking? Well, that part of the brain that's talking probably isn't functioning to tell other parts of the brain things they already know. It's not trying to explain decisions it already made, or attitudes it already holds. The part of the brain that's communicating is there to put information into the minds of other people. And this idea has a lot of implications. Not just for humans, for other species as too. And we're going to return to some of those in later lectures. But the part of the brain that's talking has a different function necessarily than accuracy. And knowing that is very, very important. Helps you understand what you're seeing here a lot more. In any case, in most respects, our entire brain and our body are going to function without genuine knowledge as to why it does what it does, just like the talking parts of our brain. In order to keep pumping, our heart doesn't need to know why it evolved. It doesn't need to understand its adaptive function as a pump. Our brain doesn't even need to understand the function of the heart as a pump to keep it pumping. In fact, our brain doesn't even need any conscious awareness that our heart exists to get the heart to keep pumping. And to make that point very clear, if I was to ask all of you to name every single major organ and system in your body, I suspect many of you couldn't do it without dedicated years of study. And that's not thinking about, all the different types of tissues in your body, different types of cells. How does your immune system work? How many pieces are it made up of? We don't have much conscious awareness of this stuff because we don't need it. We don't need to consciously understand all the specifics of the respiration process. We just need to breathe properly. We don't need to understand all the reasons that went into our behavior as long as we are behaving properly. We don't need all the processes of thinking to be available to all parts of the brain at all time. We just need to know their outputs. And in a more modern example, we don't need to know the specifics of how computers are built and work in order to successfully use one to complete a variety of tasks. Evolution as a process is metaphorically blind to what we think or what we know or what we feel. For lack of a better word here, evolution can only see what we do. And feelings and knowledges and emotions that don't contribute to behavior similarly will have no impact on reproduction and adaptive function and an evolution by natural selection. If we can behave successfully without knowing the specifics as to why we do, then the evolutionary process is not going to develop a large, costly system, not going to grow it, not going to develop it, not going to maintain it, to hook all these different mental mechanisms up and connect each part of the brain to every other piece. We don't need to have every bit of knowledge flowing from every part to every part. We just need to have each part working and producing the proper behavior. And make no mistake, it would be incredibly costly to build a system like that. A part of the brain that was truly hooked up to every other single part of the brain. And that's just thinking about one part of the brain. If you try to hook every part of the brain up to every other part of the brain, it'd be a nightmare. It requires too many connections. It's not efficient. If you only had, let's say, 3 different cognitive adaptations, A, B, and C, well, you can hook A up to B, you can hook A up to C, and hook B up to C. That's only 3 connections. Now let's say you had 6 different cognitive adaptations. In this case, you now have 15 different required connections. And that's just thinking about hooking them up one to one, A to B, A to C, A to D, A to E, B to C, B to D, etc. If you want to get any more complicated by hooking interactions of them up, the interaction between A and B to C, the number of connections that would be required rises. It's beyond exponential growth. It rises so much faster than that, they call it combinatorial explosion. And so many connections would probably stop the brain from working at all, let alone working efficiently, because too much information would have to be shared between too many different pieces, and you simply wouldn't have the metabolic resources or the space in your body to do it. Indeed, this is actually kind of a funny irony that results from this, which is that we're often mentally, cognitively blind to the functioning or even existence of our different psychological or physiological systems. We don't know what exists in our own mind and our own body precisely because they operate so automatically and efficiently. It just seems normal to us. And these efficient processes work so well they hide their own existence from each other by virtue of the fact that they're this good. In fact, it's usually only when something breaks that we become aware of the existence of things at all. Simply put, species have to come prepared to the world, able to carry out the important tasks of life automatically and efficiently. And as we're going to see soon, this carries lots of implications for adaptations for learning. But before we get into learning, I want to make one last little quick stop to the matter of what I referred to earlier as proximate and ultimate functioning. In this case, we're going to talk about proximate and ultimate explanations. Proximate here means immediate. How does something work in the here and now, in the moment? What are the immediate causes of behavior, if you want to explain the behavior? So we're going to think about anger here, to make the point clear. If you see someone get angry and they punch a hole in a wall, you might want to know why they're angry, and you might want to know why they did what they did. Why are you angry? Why did you punch a hole in the wall? Typical proximate explanation for this behavior could be something like, they just received some bad news, they didn't get a promotion at work. That's why they're angry. It's the immediate stimulus that triggered the response. Similarly, this behavior was then caused by their anger. Angry people get aggressive because of the release of certain hormones in their brain, which activate certain muscular systems in the body while inhibiting other systems, and the end result is someone takes their anger out in the wall and puts a hole in it. And while this might be enough of an explanation for people, and they're happy to stop there because it serves their practical needs, in fact, they probably don't need to know about the hormones and the muscular systems or any of that. It probably goes well beyond their practical needs. We still haven't really fully understood why this behavior occurred. Because while anger feels very normal for us, and we intuitively understand what it's like to feel angry emotionally and how we might behave when we're angry, the perception of anger doesn't just exist as a default. We need dedicated mental mechanisms to make anger exist in the first place, just like we need dedicated mechanisms to create the perceptions of color or sound. And for these mechanisms that make anger to persist over time, they either have to be serving some adaptive function or be a byproduct of another system. So this leads us to try and provide an answer to questions about ultimate functioning. Why do these mechanisms that generate anger exist? What adaptive problems are they solving? Why do they use the inputs they do? Why do they generate the outputs they do? How do those outputs aid in solving this adaptive problem? And we call these the ultimate explanations in this case because once you've explained the presence of a behavior by uncovering the adaptive functions of what mechanisms generate it, you don't need to keep explaining things anymore. That is, once you understand why an adaptation reproduces itself, you have fully understood why it exists. You don't need to explain why something that reproduces itself exists. So we're going to turn to anger here to see why. Our man is angry in the immediate proximate sense because they didn't get a promotion. But we have to keep asking questions. Why does not getting a promotion make this person angry? There's still something to explain there, so we haven't fully understood the behavior. Well, let's say they're angry at not getting a promotion because now they're going to have less money. Okay, well, why does less money make somebody angry? Well, because not having money means he can't afford the things he was expecting to buy. Okay, but why does expecting being able to afford things and then having that expectation violated make you angry? And this line of questioning is going to continue back to the point that you reach something that doesn't require further explanation. And in this case, we reach that point when the thing we're tracing back reaches the point where the mechanisms that generate it reproduce themselves better than their competition. And we can do the same thing for behavior. Why does anger trigger aggressive behaviors like hitting? Because if you just say a man hit the wall because he's angry, you can't explain that by saying anger makes you want to hit something. That's just circular. You explain the fact that someone hit the wall because they were angry, and you explain that by saying anger makes you want to hit a wall. That's just a restatement of what we already know. We might start asking other questions like, well, why doesn't being angry make you want to jump up and down in one place instead? Why don't angry people just spin in a circle? Why don't angry people hide? Why don't angry people just do nothing at all? We need to explain why the behaviors associated with anger exist, what they do, and how they help. So to fully understand psychology and behavior, then, we want to explain it not just in terms of the immediate proximate functioning of our psychology. We also want to understand what adaptive functions the mechanisms that generate this behavior serve. And this is the part I really want to drive home because a lot of people get confused here. These aren't competing explanations, they're complementary ones. Both the proximate and the ultimate explanations are required for fully understanding every aspect of physiology and psychology. If you understand what adaptive function a mechanism might serve on the ultimate level, that doesn't mean you know how it functions on every part of day-to-day life, the more proximate level. And similarly, if you see someone get angry and you understand why in the immediate sense they got angry, that doesn't mean you've understand why those inputs cause the outputs they do. You haven't explained the ultimate level yet. These are very much different levels of analysis, but can be rather useful in generating scientific hypotheses and questions for research. So we can start maybe with a ground-up approach from this. We observe some proximate behavior. And given that we see an animal behaving in some way already, we start thinking about what is the adaptive function that this behavior serves, and use that as a framework for guiding our research and understanding of it. We try to see if we can find evidence consistent or inconsistent with our proposed function for the behavior. So in keeping with our anger example, we might note that anger was triggered by not getting a raise, and a raise is in some way related to access to resources. As access to resources can carry some reproductively relevant consequences, we might hypothesize that the ultimate function of anger is a resource acquisition mechanism. And if that's true, other evidence should be consistent with this idea, such as people and other species should get angry when they're attempting to acquire or maintain access to resources. Getting angry should motivate behaviors that assist in those tasks. And if we find people are getting angry at things unrelated to access to resources, or anger typically doesn't result in people getting more access to resources, or that there are other responses to resource acquisition that don't involve anger, we might conclude that our hypothesis about adaptive function is wrong, or at the very least, incomplete. But the important part here is that our observations about proximate form can guide our search for function. If you see a behavior, you can start making hypotheses about why, on a functional level, this mechanism exists, and you can go out and test that, generate new hypotheses. You can go the opposite way too. You can use a top-down approach. So you can start with an adaptive problem that an organism might face, and then generate some hypotheses about unobserved proximate mechanisms that might exist to solve it. So if we know that resource acquisition was an adaptive problem that ancestral populations repeatedly faced, we might think about, well, what mechanisms cognitively could solve that problem, and then go search for their existence. What information was available to these groups related to resource acquisition? How could that information be translated into behavioral outputs and so on? So for instance, if you want to acquire resources, there's a pretty effective strategy of just taking them from people who already have them. Scavenger species, for instance, don't need to go through all the effort of killing an animal to get a meal. They might just piggyback on the work of other animals that put in the time and effort and took the risks to bring down the prey. Humans might do likewise. Stealing, for instance, is an example. So you might start thinking about what problems are involved in this task of resource acquisition. In this case, avoiding detection by the thing you're taking resources from. And then look for evidence of unobserved adaptations that solve this problem, like cognitive mechanisms that selectively attend to cues of being observed and behave differently when you are being observed versus when you're not being observed. The ultimate function can guide our search for proximate mechanisms as well. So tying this all together, as we saw from the split brain patients, we don't need to be aware of the ultimate reasons for our behavior. We don't even necessarily need to be aware of the proximate reasons for our behavior. Because evolution can only see what we do, we don't need to know everything about what we do. We simply need to do it. And this point's important because a lot of people are going to get this mistaken idea in their head that they aren't consciously thinking about sex or reproduction when they do things like eat food or enjoy a movie or exercise or watch streams about evolutionary psychology. And because they aren't consciously thinking about reproduction, this means that any type of adaptive explanation for the behavior is somehow silly or it's wrong. You don't watch a video to reproduce, right? You watch a video to be entertained. And so you might explain your watching as proximate entertainment, and that's true enough. But to more fully understand why you find one thing entertaining, another thing not entertaining, you need to understand what the functions of the mechanisms are that are generating this feeling of entertainment, and why they use the inputs they do to give the outputs that they do. And these aren't competing explanations. Again, I want to restate that. They're complementary. They just work at different levels of analysis. So while we start explaining the adaptive function of psychological traits, I don't want you to be misled into thinking that I'm talking about how they might feel in the moment, or what thoughts are crossing conscious awareness at any given time. A man might have hit the wall because he felt angry, and understanding those mechanisms that generate anger and respond to what they do and generate the outputs they do, this enhances our understanding of anger and the behavior hitting the wall, and if we desire, helps us change it. But the point is, these aren't competing explanations. It's not, I hit the wall because I was angry, or I hit the wall because I have this mechanism for generating anger that functions for this reason. These are two different explanations of the exact same thing that complement each other and enhance our understanding. And it's this ultimate level of analysis that the evolutionary perspective is really going to offer psychology. Without it, we're going to have a lot of difficulty structuring our understanding of knowledge and behavior, and we're not going to be searching in the right places for explanations. In fact, a lot of psychology will propose explanations for things that can't possibly be true, because they don't know what a correct explanation looks like in the first place. And so we can use this distinction between proximate and ultimate functioning to continue and build our understanding of human psychology, as well as non-human psychology. For example, even though human behavior may vary quite a bit across the globe, a relatively universal human nature that all people across the globe have can still produce variable outcomes given different inputs from the environment. You and I could have the exact same species-typical, universal psychological adaptations in our brain, but still produce very different behaviors. We're going to think about a few examples here to make this clearer. First, let's say you and I both have the same computer game installed on identical computers. We both decide to go out and get the same Asus computer off the shelf. We both install Elden Ring on our computer. After we play Elden Ring, our characters are probably going to look different. Our playtimes are going to look different. Our experiences in the game are going to be different. We could have leveled different stats. We could have used and upgraded different gear. We could have died more or less than each other. We could have explored different areas of the world in different orders. We could have missed certain areas of the world entirely. And just because we're using the same specialized hardware to run the same specialized software, the different inputs that we feed the system can result in some very different outputs. But despite those different outputs, there's still this identical computer, hardware and software, lurking underneath. And you can think about this in terms of our brain and our psychologies. So moving to a biological example, let's say we have two genetically identical organisms. In this case, the twins that married twins. This could be, in this case, because the same egg divided during development, or just because the organisms reproduce asexually. They split in half, make two more or less genetically identical copies. In either case, when you have two genetically identical organisms, that doesn't mean they're always going to look and act exactly the same. While they may be, and often are, quite similar to each other, they're not truly identical to the extent that they are going to be receiving different inputs throughout their life. One might be smaller than another because one has better access to nutrition. One might be a murderer because they get into a situation with a bad romantic relationship the other one doesn't. And while they might have the same genes, what we would call their genotype, they don't necessarily end up with the same bodies, what we call the phenotype. And similarly, they don't necessarily behave identically throughout their life. So you and I can have the exact same psychological adaptations, what we would call the same human nature, just like you and I have the same general organs in our body, but we're still going to produce variable outcomes because that exact same type of underlying psychological nature, that human nature that we have, encounters different circumstances. And this is important because just because you see people varying in their behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean they have different psychological adaptations. it's a real important point to bear in mind for understanding the psychology of living things. Just as there are proximate and ultimate levels of explanation to a behavior that complement and enhance our understanding of it, there's also the ability to understand the nature of the psychological adaptations that are present in all species that help us understand why they use the inputs they do and respond the way they do when situations vary. That there's a proximate ultimate level to explanation, and there's a proximate and there's an ultimate level to the manifestations of our physiology and our psychology. So, with all this in mind, we're now going to turn to the matter of learning. And learning is kind of a curious thing, a little bit difficult to define at times. But on a broad level, I would say we can conceptualize learning as a change in the knowledge and or behavior of an organism based on experience. In this case, the physical wiring of your brain in some capacity changes in response to experience. Now, a lot of people here are tempted to contrast terms like learning and adaptation, as if adaptations are somehow these fixed things and learning are these flexible things. But this is a very false dichotomy. As we're going to see, the capacity to learn itself is an adaptation. Just like the ability to see doesn't exist as a default, and you need lots of specialized organs and mechanisms to generate perceptions of color and depth, or perhaps the ability to feel pain doesn't exist as a default, as anyone who's ever experienced general anesthesia knows. The ability to learn is also something that doesn't just exist. It has to be manufactured by our genetics. Neural circuits need to have the capacity to rewire themselves based on experience. It's not something that just exists as a default. And while learning can be a very important adaptation, or rather, an important series of adaptations, before learning gets to be useful to an organism, it needs to know what to learn, and it needs to know how to learn it. And that's going to sound a little strange at first, I'm sure. Because if you need to know what to learn and how to learn it, doesn't that kind of mean you already know it? But no, that's not the case. Learning just needs to be structured in very particular ways before learning is useful. Of all the books you could read in the library here, everything has to be structured for it to be useful for you. So we're going to get a bit deeper into this idea and clear it up a little bit. To start, we're going to return to another point we covered in the first lecture, which is that there are far more ways to be dead than there are to be alive. Similarly, there are far more ways to behave in maladaptive ways than there are to do things that are adaptive. For example, if you fail to solve a problem of respiration in some capacity, you die. So we all have lungs, and they all function very similarly to each other. Similarly, of all the things in the world you might find sexually attractive, trees, clouds, fish, water, rocks, whatever, only a very small number of those things you might find sexually attractive are going to eventually result in behaviors that are likely to pass on your genes. Same logic applies to learning. There are basically an endless number of things you might learn, an endless number of ways you might change your behavior that are useless or wrong. Like if you're trying to improve a car in this case. If you open up the hood of a car and you make a change to the engine at random, remove a part, add a part, modify a part, the odds are good that you're going to make the functioning of the car worse rather than improve it. For the same reason most mutations that people get, they tend to be maladaptive. Random changes don't favor the improvement of complex systems. If anything, they tend to do the opposite. So out of the infinite number of possible things you might learn, your brain needs to be prepared to dramatically and automatically cut that field down to only the most important and useful pieces to end up making learning useful. Because learning ultimately represents a change in your behavior, the thing evolution can see that it can select for, the mechanisms that result in learning need to change your behavior to some of the very few that are going to end up being adaptively useful before the mechanism can be selected for. So this is our first point here to really bear in mind. Learning needs to be non-random. Learning needs to be heavily constrained and directed to be of any use. Rather than adaptations constraining learning in this case, as many people would think, adaptations mean fixed, learning means flexible. Adaptations in this case actually create the ability to learn in the first place, and they guide that learning to be useful. The second point to bear in mind here is that our learning adaptations need to know how to learn to make learning feasible in the first place. That is, there isn't this one general purpose learning mechanism in our heads that's just equally good at learning anything, because the demands of learning are going to differ substantially from task to task. Returns again to our kitchen example. We have lots of different tools in the kitchen because the demands of the task we have to solve vary so drastically. And you can't just design a tool to do useful things, because doing useful things is too underspecified. And doing one thing well often means doing another thing poorly. The same logic is going to apply to learning. You can't have an adaptation that just learns things, because the demands of learning are going to differ too much from task to task. And we're going to highlight a couple examples to make this point clear. Typical learning example a lot of people come across in introductory to psychology courses is what we call a Skinner box, which is part of what you can see here. A variant of this is brought up in a lot of empirical research, a lot of psychology textbooks. General setup here is you have this box, and you put a rat in it, and in this box there is a lever. And when the rat presses the lever, a food pellet drops out. And so by rewarding the behavior of pressing the lever with giving the rat food, you get the rat to start pressing the lever. You make the behavior more common, and the rat learns this association between performing this action and getting a reward. And you can do the same thing with punishments too. If you're a bit of a masochist, that rat presses a lever, you can electrify the floor of the cage and give the rat a shock. And this is going to result in the rat learning to not touch the lever again. Kind of like how if you touch a hot stove as a kid, you probably learn to not touch the hot stove again because it hurts you. That's Skinner box. Classic example of learning in psychology. So let's say we have an adaptation for learning that works with this general logic, which is that a behavior immediately followed by a positive outcome should be performed more often, whereas a behavior immediately followed by a negative outcome should be performed less. It's a fine general purpose learning mechanism that could operate here for lots of different things. It's a great mechanism for learning in Skinner boxes, but it doesn't solve a lot of the important tasks of life very well. Couple examples of why. In the first one, many things in life don't afford you lots of learning trials. So if you're a rat, you don't get to learn which animals in the world are predators and which aren't by interacting with them first. The rat that approaches a cat is going to get killed and eaten more often than it doesn't. The cat, in other words, is not providing the rat with a lot of learning trials to figure out that it's dangerous. Organisms need to know a lot of things as they enter life. A lot of important knowledge needs to be prepared. And this is going to apply to learning as well. We need to be prepared to learn certain things more than others. Here's another case. Let's say cause and effect are separated by large stretches of time, like the case of ingesting food. If a food's poisonous and you eat it, you may not feel the effects of that until several minutes or several hours after you've eaten it. If you've ever eaten something and you start experiencing stomach pain and vomiting later, you'll know exactly what I mean. It's not that you just put the food in your mouth and you immediately vomit. Sometimes it takes quite a bit longer for these effects to become apparent. So think about this general learning mechanism we were talking about. How is this learning mechanism supposed to know that the food you ate several hours ago is the cause of your current physical discomfort? After all, you don't teach rats to learn by giving them food 2 hours after they press a lever. That's not how these typical Skinner boxes work. There are too many intervening variables that might have been the cause of this physical discomfort for that learning mechanism to single out any one. Why is my stomach hurting now? Was it the food I ate 4 hours ago? Was it the walk I took just now? Was it because I stubbed my toe? Was it because I walked into this room? How is the learning mechanism supposed to know that the thing that happened several hours ago caused the current discomfort? In order for a learning mechanism to make that assumption, or rather make that connection, it needs to make certain assumptions about particular structures of cause and effect. This learning mechanism, to make the connection between eating food and being nauseous several hours later, needs to know how to learn before it can learn. And then there's yet another case here, where the type of reward structure doesn't really resemble how learning happens in many capacities. Humans, for instance, do not learn language by receiving a constant stream of rewards. Humans appear born with a very natural capacity to learn language, both in terms of understanding it and producing it, as evidenced by the fact that humans learn language more or less passively just by being around people who are talking. It's not a process of constant rewards and punishments and explicit instructions. And we can tell these adaptations are rather human-specific because no matter how much you might talk to a pet, a cat or a dog, say, or pretty much any other animal on the planet for that matter, they don't seem to show any pattern of learning language remotely approximating what humans do. Sure, it's possible that you can teach a pet a couple rudimentary commands after repeated explicit instructions and rewards, but their understanding of language is, again, extremely rudimentary at best, probably not too far removed from, say, my ability to tell that a cat's meow indicates something different than a cat's hiss. And interestingly, when it comes to learning language, we also know that adaptations to learn language in humans shut off at some point. Likely because it wasn't required past certain ages in ancestral human environments, where you're probably unlikely to travel far enough, consistently enough in your life to recurrently encounter people that are speaking different languages. So while people can learn languages later in life, many of us have, and by later here I usually mean after the age 10 or so, people can still learn languages after a certain age, but it becomes a very slow, deliberate, explicit, effortful process, and leaves people speaking with an accent more often than it doesn't. The reason learning language is so different between young and old age here is actually because the mechanisms that are being used for the task are different. And the older people are using different learning mechanisms that aren't well suited for the task of learning language. And we're going to see some more concrete examples of all these learning mechanisms in action next time. But before that next lesson, there's one point that I want to touch on today, one last point, which is that many people tend to ascribe just about any change in behavior that happens after birth to learning. So while animals do tend to learn a lot over their lifetimes, and learning does represent a change in behavior, not all changes in behavior are instances of learning. Now, this is tempting because you see like a human baby is born and it doesn't know how to speak and it doesn't know how to walk and it doesn't know how to dress and it doesn't know what appropriate behavior is. And as it gets older, all of these pieces start to fill in. But that doesn't necessarily mean at any given step that it was learning as we typically conceive of it. And we can think of this first on the physiological side of things. which is that something being absent at birth doesn't mean it's not an adaptation, and it doesn't mean it needs to be learned. So infants aren't born with teeth, but they do naturally develop their adult teeth over time. Similarly, children undergo puberty later in their life. But despite puberty, teeth, these features not being present at birth, we wouldn't say that a child learned to grow adult teeth, or they learned to undergo puberty. There's a lot of development that's going to take place in the absence of learning. And we have no reason to suspect that's not true of our psychology as well. That is, some cognitive adaptations are going to come online or develop or become more or less active at different points in the lifespan, but it might not necessarily reflect a learning process. One example we're going to see in later talks, probably next class, is that human females often change their behavior when they become pregnant. Specifically, they start avoiding certain foods they used to enjoy. And they start doing that, they start avoiding these foods, at least proximately, because it makes them sick. Call this pregnancy sickness. And pregnancy sickness seems to represent a specific adaptation that turns on during critical developmental windows, and then when that window closes and the necessity for it is diminished, the adaptation turns off again. Now, whether you'd consider this an example of learning or development is something we could debate, but the point I want to stick in your brain right now is that key adaptations may turn on or off throughout our lifespan without a learning process being required. One thing that people have mentioned to me before, for instance, is that I say I don't ever feel that cuteness when I see a child. I've never looked at a child and really thought, oh, that's very cute, I would like to raise one of my own. And many parents very confidently assure me it's different when it's your own child. And what they're saying there is that there are mechanisms in your brain for parenting. And these mechanisms are going to turn on in the presence of certain stimulus, of certain inputs. But currently they're not active because you're not receiving them. They don't necessarily know that's what they're saying, but that is effectively what they're trying to communicate. That doesn't mean, though, that they learned to love a child. It could just mean that there are some adaptations that are present that haven't been triggered by the right environmental stimulus yet. And speaking of, I don't want to get bogged down in this false idea that because something is an adaptation, that somehow means it's genetically determined. Or that to say something is an adaptation is in some way antithetical to saying it was caused by environmental influences or learning. Everything that develops in humans, cognitively or otherwise, and every other species, is always determined by an interaction between environmental and genetic factors. That is, teeth can't develop unless the body has the necessary materials to develop them. Even though most people typically do get those resources and most people do typically develop teeth, if you manage to raise them in an environment, say, without any calcium, they're not going to develop teeth or their other bones because they're lacking a critical resource, a critical input the system requires. And this idea that traits are caused more or less by genetic or environmental factors, and that there's some kind of spectrum where something being caused more by the genes means it's being caused less by the environment, it's a false dichotomy and it should be done away with a long time ago. And similarly, there's going to be no distinction that's made between something being genetic or learned. That's a false dichotomy. We have genetic endowments that allow us to learn, like a mechanism that allows us to learn language extremely efficiently. But those mechanisms won't develop properly unless we're around other people speaking language. If we're not around people speaking language, the mechanisms will not work. They will not develop the capacity to speak. And while that language learning mechanism learns, also varies a lot depending on what type of environment it's placed around. So that is, if you take an infant and you raise it in America, it's probably going to be born and learn to speak English. Whereas if you take that same infant and you raise it in China, it's probably going to learn to speak Chinese instead. The same learning adaptation is going to be producing different outcomes depending on the content of the environment. And so, in order for the environmental factors to impact development in general, and for learning to happen specifically, we need biological mechanisms that allow this to matter. And those biological mechanisms in turn rely heavily on environmental factors to work. It's an interaction you can't separate out. So I don't want you to come up with this idea that something is either an adaptation or it's learned. It's a false dichotomy. You need adaptations for learning. And next time we're going to see examples of those.